Welcome to a very special podcast which launches an exciting partnership between well-established organizations. This is in anticipation of the 13th of March conference called Employment 360, which is being organized by Fenech and Fenech Law Firm and Shireburn Software. Also with the input of Misco, and we have some exciting news to bring to you with the announcement, obviously, of the 2026 deadline for the famous now EU Transparency Directive. To be honest with you, when I met Paul and he mentioned this directive, I knew very, very little about it. And upon digging and reading up on it, I got interested and more so excited as to the changes that this directive will bring about to the Maltese workplace. Cultural changes that, if we take seriously, can actually bring about quite, I would say, cataclysmic change, really, to our workplaces, our work cultures, and the way we do things. But what is this EU Transparency Directive? Here I have two experts on the subject. We've decided that this is a subject that is too important and too difficult possibly to break down alone. So here I have with me Dr. Paul Gonzi, a partner at Fenech and Fenech, to give us the legal side and break it down. And also Zammit from Misco, an economist and HR consultancy and data analyst, and obviously famous for data analytics and also economic analysis and HR consultancy. So in our podcast today, we'd like to address really the following aspects of the directive. What does it mean for companies, for Maltese companies? How will it impact our workers? And what are the real implications behind the legal and economic jargon? I cannot stress, please, to my guests to limit the economic and the political jargon and also the legal jargon so that we can break it down in very, very simple words. I will translate in case. Okay, let's start with Paul. Paul, this hype about the Pay Transparency Directive, what is it exactly?
Look, Mick, from a legal perspective, I would say what we're talking about here is an evolution of a law that has existed since the 50s. Built up over the 70s. In 2006, the EU always had the principle of equal pay enshrined in a number of directives. But today, we have a game changer in the sense of whilst the principle doesn't change, we have the EU telling all employers, listen, what we've tried to get you to do has not quite worked because the percentage in terms of pay gap between male and female sexes has maybe gotten a bit smaller, but not small enough. And we're going to force onto you changes which make you effectively and proactively trigger the change that we need. Okay? In essence, transparency, and that is why we call it the Pay Transparency Directive. It is going to force employers to no longer hide its pay structures, if they had any, but on the inverse, it's actually going to get them to divulge the detail of how they came up with their pays. They're going to have to share the detail of those pays with job applicants and with their employees, and they're going to have to also share details about pay progression within the organization. So from my perspective, whilst to have an evolution of the law, it is a revolution in terms of, the culture within an employment workplace, because we have to change the way things are done, and especially locally, from my experience in the employment field, and I'm sure Lawrence can also pitch in on this, our experience is that employers tend to prefer to keep things within their own parameters without sharing too much with employees. This is going to change.
Ooh, that's big. It's really big. It has to change. But Lawrence, tell me, in 2025, why are we still talking about a gender pay gap? What is the problem?
There are some social reasons for that, because as long as women will be penalized for example, taking a career break for the first 3 years, 4 years after maternity, for example. As long as that is going to happen, then there will be that sort of pay gap, essentially. There are a number of professions where it shouldn't exist because there is a majority of women in that profession, and two, because of collective bargaining, there should be equal pay for equal work enshrined in such collective agreements. The problem starts when you have smallish organizations, and Malta has too many of those. And when I say small, I don't mean less than 10 people, but I mean less than 50 people, for example, because then you tend to have individual negotiation on salaries, and therefore it is very easy to have a difference in pays, not only between genders but also between male and female, female and female. So I think the structure of the labour market is such where it doesn't help to have pay transparency, and it doesn't help to have equal pay for equal work.
Okay, so no more gossip on pays in the workplace. Paul, you're a top employment lawyer in this country, and you know our workplaces hide information on pays, assume our members of staff are not discussing pays. What are the legal pitfalls of not complying with this legislation? What are the difficulties that you're finding when you're discussing with clients?
There are a number of difficulties, Mikela. I think first and foremost, most people who do payroll, HR, and those who are leading businesses have not yet understood what it means to have a pay structure, which is effectively going to lead you to compliance, lead you to be able to report on the gender gap, which is something this directive brings into play, right? Employers are going to have to report the gender gap within their organization generally, but also within a number of categories. So you have to be able, as an employer, first and foremost, to categorize your employment structure within categories. How do you do that? How do you go about that? And there are ways and means, there are different ways and means. There's no one size fits all, but there is guidance that we should be relying on, guidance which is not quite new, mind you. So the EU Commission had published guidance decades ago on how to do these things, but definitely in Malta and also in other EU jurisdictions, right? It hasn't been done, or it hasn't been done properly. Some employers have structures, but you would have done it by sitting around the table, sharing thoughts about job descriptions which you think are identifying separate roles, without actually stopping to think twice to see whether certain jobs, despite them having different titles, or at first glance looking like they are different, actually have the same value. So one of the first things that this directive is going to make us all do in order to be able to justify any pay gaps that we have is to classify. So carry out your pay audit, undertake an evaluation of the structures that you have, because if you don't, and if you're not able to justify the differences in pay for those employees who are carrying out equal work or work of equal value, you're going to potentially now be exposed to a number of things. What are these things? First, employees can come and make complaints themselves. Secondly, authorities are going to be empowered to act on behalf of employees, also with class actions. That is the idea behind the directive. The directive is encouraging, when you read the wording, it is encouraging the facilitation for employees to be able to understand that there is discrimination, which can be direct or indirect. Indirect meaning that you think that at face value everything is fine, but in truth you are impacting a number of employees in a manner which is discriminatory towards them. Generally, the female sex tends to be the victim to indirect discrimination, and the directive is trying to overcome that. What is it trying to do as well? Directive, it is encouraging member states to roll out more severe fines, more severe penalties for employers who fail to abide by the several obligations that employers have. It is pushing towards having more recourse to redress, as well as the ability to get compensation for employees who suffered, in a way that you go back in time, and therefore employees would be entitled to compensation based on what they've lost in terms of lost income, but also lost promotions or loss of earnings, as well as potentially moral damages, which, as we say in Maltese law, is not something which we quite commonly talk about. It's a concept quite alien to our law. We've seen moral damages come in slowly through the window, for instance, with data protection, and now we're here with equal pay as well. Other exposure is that if your pay gap results show a discrepancy of more than 5% within a particular category, you're going to be obliged to sit down with unions or employee representatives to go through what the directive refers to as a joint pay assessment, which is effectively an audit where you have to justify the entire structure that you have, the categories of data that you've segregated, and why you treat them the same or not, and then try to justify also the discrepancies in pay. Now, to be clear, the fact that you have a gender pay gap does not necessarily mean that you are discriminating against employees. And the directive is clear that you can pay employees differently, even though they are effectively in the same work or work of equal value, provided you have an objective justification. Therefore, we're looking at employers being able to turn around and defend the structures that they have, the pay structures that they have, which have to be objective and gender neutral. These are the terms that are used in the directive. I think this is more or less what I would say the directive is trying to achieve, and therefore what employers have to watch out for going forward.
I mean, listening to you, to me, it sounds like a revolution, a cultural revolution for the workplace, especially in Malta, where we tend to keep salaries, especially under wrap, behind, closed doors, locked up in cupboards, sometimes even from HR functions. Lawrence, how do you turn to a business owner and tell him or her, I know you're paying the salaries, but I'm going to tell you how you have to pay them, and you have to justify. You can't wake up one morning and decide to pay Paul more than Lawrence just on a whim, just because you want to, just because you feel they're more loyal. These job evaluations, how in heaven's name, when some of us can't even come together with a vacancy announcement or a job description properly, how are we going to do them?
We can take it from a negative perspective, the fear of breaking the law and the lawmakers coming after you, or we can look at it from a positive perspective. There is good practice. Good practice is that you have a good organization structure. You have good organizational design, where you actually structure the organization according to different departments and according to a hierarchy which the employer will have the right to choose, will have the right to decide upon. There's nothing to stop the employer to determine the organization structure. There needs to be a remuneration policy. On what basis am I going to determine remuneration? What allowances am I going to give or not give? On what basis do I give those allowances? Today we are used to allowances, for example, a shift allowance or a qualification allowance or a communication allowance. Obviously, if I am going to give an employee a transportation allowance or a fuel allowance, then the employee has to have a car. I can't just give you a fuel allowance and you don't have a car because you are you, and someone else then has a car will not qualify for that. So a remuneration policy will explain how people will qualify for these allowances. Job descriptions, position descriptions, which determine the objective of the job, who they report to, who gets reported, and the role, what it entails. It doesn't mean a list of duties. Again, let's make this distinction. We're not talking of a list of duties, but we're talking about, in broad terms, what the outcome which the person is expected to produce. Not the input, not the output, but the outcome. There needs to be a performance management system to assess the performance of people and link increments of salaries to that performance management system. These are all good practices which have been promoted in Malta, and we have been promoting. You have been promoting, we have been promoting. And I think once you have these good practices in place, then it becomes that bit easier to determine the value of a job. If you don't have any of that, how can you do it? No, you can't do it. So I think the answer to everything is, let's look at this Pay Transparency Directive as an exhortation, as an encouragement, as a motivation to implement HR good practices.
Without a shadow of a doubt, at the end of the day, when you have good, transparent pay practices and HR practices, then your workforce are much happier and they feel that they are treated fairer. However, that does not mean that we are not going to get a bit of a shock. Employers, when they go through this Pay Transparency Directive, will obviously look at it from their perspective. So, Paul, when it comes to recruitment, generally speaking, one of the first questions that you would ask is, what is your expected salary, right? And if your expected salary is X, and I was ready to give you X plus 2, generally speaking, 9 times out of 10, you will say, okay, I am going to pay you less because your expectation is less than what I was going to offer you. How does this change when it comes to the Pay Transparency Directive, and what are the legal implications of not changing them?
It changes, Mikela. It changes because now employers are not going to be able to ask those questions anymore. They can't turn around to the candidate and say, what is your expectation? What is your current salary income? What is your income history? You can't ask those questions. It's prohibited. It's going to be prohibited as from 2026. So what is it trying to achieve as a law? It is trying to achieve a situation where the employee, before signing up to any employment relationship, by signing on the employment contract, will be able to understand what is offered by the employer actually in terms of the salary bracket for the particular role that he or she has applied for, and be able to bargain, to negotiate the package, knowing the steps of salary progression once he or she joins the employer situation. Now, the directive says quite clearly that it doesn't mean an employer cannot try to negotiate, but at the same time, that negotiation is going to be done within certain rules of a game, right? You're going to have parameters, as Lauren said, which are calculated based on the value of the job per se. And this is something which the listeners of this podcast need to really understand here. When you're coming up with your job classification and therefore determining what pay package is going to be pegged to a particular job, the first step is understanding the value of that particular job, the value of the job, not of the person, not of the candidate, not your assessment, which is subjective, of the potential performance abilities of the individual per se. That's the first step, okay? And what's important as well from the directive is that the directive is looking at the full, I would say, employment life cycle. So it's recognizing candidates, applicants, that is what the directive says. It is then talking about the situation where the employee steps in and is going to be told information about the pay structure. It also specifies the rights of employees to request information and the obligation on the employer to reply within 2 months from a request with the information about the individual's own pay position within the company, as well as how that compares with the rest of the pay position within the organization. So there's that. And then latching back onto what Lawrence said earlier, there is also in the directive itself some direction to employers on pay progression. So when you're looking at pay progression, how do I then step up? How do I get a salary increase? How do I get promoted? Employers there too have to be able to justify their decision based on objective, gender-neutral criteria, but with some more flexibility in the sense of the directive recognizing that you can, at that stage, after employment, look at length of service, performance, competence of the individual this time round, not the value of the job per se. So it's a full life cycle, and at every stage, you have to look at things differently. But people in HR, people who are going to be doing these assessments, need to be aware of all this from a comprehensive perspective and understand the different stages. It's a life cycle.
I mean, this piece of legislation from an HR perspective. So I've worked in HR, I've worked on the front line. This is an enabling legislation for HR to actually put in very good best practices in HR. So, for example, even eliminating the fact that, generally speaking, 8 times out of 10, women will not ask for salaries at the higher level as men would for the same job, and they would generally be paid less because it is in women's nature not to pit themselves at a higher salary level. Also, when it comes to job evaluations and the added value of job evaluations, how do you, for example, if you're frontline working in a shop, how do you quantify the added value of a personality, of someone that's going to deal with an old person walking into your establishment and the patience that you have to have with the elder generations? You know, these are aspects that are very objective, but subjective actually more than objective, and that is going to be very difficult. So our mindset has to shift. Now, when shifting mindsets, especially on a small island state, Lawrence, with companies that are generally speaking locally owned and family-run businesses where relationships are tight, where you have, I know you and someone knows someone else and etc. How is it going to impact? Is it realistic to say that our workplaces are going to react positively to this legislation?
Like with any sort of legislation, I'm old enough to remember the introduction of seatbelts in this country, and the
Me too.
the obligation to wear a helmet when you're riding a motorbike. you can say how stifling it is, or you can say this is a way of saving lives. And I think that's the way we have to look at it. So even when it comes to, for example, determining salaries, we tell our clients whenever they ask us about salary benchmarks in the market, we highlight the need that, okay, this is the information in the market, but then where do you want to pitch yourself in the market? Do you want to be known as a best payer? Are you like a training ground company, so you start off with lower salaries? Do you want to pitch yourself around the average, and there is logic in pitching around yourself around the average? Or do you think that because you're a licensed company, then you should be somewhere around the upper quartile? So a company needs to set these policies, just like it sets marketing strategies, financial feasibilities, and this sort of thing. They need to start seeing what strategy they should have for their HR. And I think this legislation actually gives the opportunity to the HR function to become more strategic in outlook. Unfortunately today, the HR function not only doesn't have a seat at the board, but don't think many of them even have a seat at the management committee level, at the senior management level. So this is the opportunity for HR now to prove its worth. And we can no longer now just limit HR. We do some recruitment, and I love to organize training, and I am the HR manager, and that's what I will concentrate on. Now it's got to go into strategic issues, and then having said that, there is a whole myriad of things to look at in terms of data within the company, again, data and the market. And then job evaluation becomes easier. I think if we ask the question, is it right that you underpay people? And probably hand on heart we say no. And is it right to overpay people? And hand on heart we say no. So the idea is that on the basis of information, which an employer can gather from the market through the services of Fenech, ourselves and yourselves at Shireburn, at Misco, it will be possible to obtain enough information to then take the appropriate decisions. And I think that is crucial. That when it comes to job evaluation, it is possible. It's good practice to say, look, it's only fair that I pay these two people the same if the value of the job. Now, you gave the example of someone in the retail area, in the retail sector, who is meeting with clients. Now, whether I, as an employer, I want to give importance to that or not is up to the employer. But then the person won't find the right people. So this is why a job description is important, because that will determine what do you want to give importance to. And on the basis of those factors, you then determine the value of the job.
Agreed. Paul, you meet clients all the time, and you've been discussing, I know you've been researching the Pay Transparency Directive, you and your team, for quite a number of years now. So suffice it to say that you know not just the articles, but the sub-articles and where they come from and which legislation in the 1960s they originated from, and the white papers, and God knows everything else about the pay transparency. If you were to go into a client's room, how do you start? How do you bring it up? Where would they start from? Because, you know, this is, for me, this is like manna for an HR professional. You know, this is really going to make a very, very big difference. But to, you know, clients that actually have to start decoding it, where do you start from? What advice do you give them?
If I can say something, actually, Mikela, the law, as I said at the start, is not new, right? So we also have to keep in mind that in parallel with the new directive, we have to keep in mind the existing Maltese legislation that we have in place. So the new directive, as with all EU directives, talks about equality between genders and the sexes. So equal pay between men and women is the starting point. This new directive introduces the concept of protecting employees who fall within another protected category, for example, if they have a disability or if they are, of a particular race, for example. So it introduces the importance of parallel protection, so to speak. But Maltese law, for now decades, has had the concept of equal pay and has referred to the idea of categorization of employees and pay evaluation for decades. okay? But without actually saying it's between sexes. So in truth, we could have had claims, and there have been a handful of claims in Malta between male and male, female and female. So my starting point to employers is to say, listen, this is not that the directive comes into force in June 2026 and we can take it easy, and we start afresh. In truth, the risk of some form of complaint or challenge has been there for many decades. Now we have to recognize the fact that we have to pull up our socks. We can't wait until 2026. Let's use our time wisely to prepare ourselves on many fronts, as Lauren said. So we can look at our own data. We can look at tech to see what type of technology is out there to help us. We can look at what we're using in terms of systems to manage our payroll. Then we have to ask ourselves the questions, right? Who is competent from our organization to sit around the table to understand what we're trying to achieve? Let's make sure we're all speaking the same language, because sometimes, I can come up to you, Mikela, as HR and tell you, do you understand what the concept of equal pay is? Then you'll call in someone who's a manager, who's going to tell you what the team is doing, and you'll ask them, do you understand what the concept of equal pay is? How can you compare one job with another? And until you're sure that you're speaking that same language, I think you shouldn't start the process. So for me, my advice to HR is get some form of training. Understand the language that this law is requiring us to talk about. Okay? Understand the difference between job evaluation at the start and then job progression throughout the employment life cycle. Once you get that, it's literally you have to have different people wearing different hats. So HR is going to come in and look at the current structures and try to get this journey from beginning to end. But you will need to rely on, as I said, the managers of a particular section or department within an authority, within an employer. Why? Because they will know the ins and outs of the particular job roles. What are the employees actually doing on a day-to-day basis? Don't look just at what the job description says, if there is a job description within the employment contract, because we know many employers don't have. Some employers still don't have employment contracts in today's day and age. So I would try to tell clients...
That's good for you.
Well, it's good and it isn't, because what we try to achieve, and I think you do the same. And also, so Lawrence, is to get people compliant, to avoid the problems and the complexities of complaints. We want to nip problems at the bud and avoid legal expenses and going to court and waste of time and the resources you need to solve issues. The truth is, this directive is going to be a wake-up call for everyone. Once we start looking into the detail, we're going to see that there are aspects of our jobs pay structures that we will need to fix. We will need to start looking at what type of narrative we have, if we do at all, to justify the pay discrepancies that there are. And this is important as well. The fact that there is a pay gap within an organization does not necessarily mean you are doing something illegal. It could be there is hidden bias somewhere which you need to fix. And if that is the case, be transparent about it. Say, listen, we are going to fix it in this manner. This is the plan. We have a projection. If need be, sit down with the employees or the representatives, etc. What we can't do is hide it, because hiding it is just letting a problem fester and it will explode in our faces down the line. Okay? We need to solve the problems by tackling them immediately, sitting together and coming up with a plan.
So this is the beauty of the Pay Transparency Directive, I think, is that we have introduced the concept of accountability. Because even when you work with managers, we've all worked with clients in the HR space and in the employment space. And at the end of the day, if you sit down with a manager, I tell you, many of them cannot write a proper job description about the jobs that their people are doing. Right. So then this is where I look at it as a mindset shift. Now a question to both of you. So we'll start with Lawrence and then I'll go to Paul. One of the most interesting aspects of the pay transparency, which probably would send shivers down some employers' spines, is employee representation. Lawrence, before we started this podcast, was saying that Malta is actually, in terms of European Union, the lowest of the countries of the European Union, which allows the representatives of the staff to be elected by the staff themselves, which seems quite outrageous, but it is true.
For health and safety.
For health and safety, we're talking. Now, for the Pay Transparency Directive, we are introducing the concept that the criteria of job evaluations and also the assessment of pay gaps, etc., needs to be discussed with employee representatives. This is quite mind-blowing for the Maltese employer, because many don't even have representatives, and if they do, they generally select them themselves. How is this going to work from your experience and then also from the legal perspective?
Again, let's take it from a positive perspective. If we promote social dialogue, bipartite and tripartite dialogue, then it becomes easier. If we keep on pitching employers against workers or trade unions, then there is going to be a power struggle. Obviously, people need to be trained. We don't just need to train employers, we need to train HR people, we need to train managers, because at the end of the day, even the line manager is an HR manager. And we need to train employees to understand what actually an employer can do and has a right to continue doing. Because at the end of the day, we need to appreciate that the employer has invested the money in the business or is accountable for the money that has been invested by the owners, by the shareholders. So I think we need to appreciate that there must be a balance somewhere. But I think it's much better to try and find this balance in a collaborative way than by a concept, by an approach where the winner takes it all. And I think that is where we need to be driving. Unfortunately, we had a good history of social dialogue, especially at the bipartite level, at the firm level, because of the presence of trade unions, collective agreements, etc. And very often solutions are found at that level. At a more national tripartite level, I think we're still miles away in that regard. And I think that's where we need to work. Because if we work then at the national level, it starts to trickle down to the basic firm level. I don't think we should be looking at this directive as if it were some chain being put around an employer's neck. I think it's the opportunity to prove, for an employer to prove that their company is a good company to work for, because we have got these good practices. It's the opportunity to make sure that employees are engaged. It is a good opportunity to show that staff turnover can be reduced. I think we need to look at all of this as an opportunity and not as a threat. And that is why it's the opportunity to put HR in a strategic role, and it is the opportunity to implement good practices.
Paul, legally.
Look, from a practical perspective, I agree with Lawrence that when you sit down with employee representatives or unions, generally you end up arriving at a consensus of sorts. Different experiences, it's not a one-size-fits-all, of course. My concern is that I'm not sure, and I don't want to generalize, but I'm going to generalize it. I'm not sure that the unions themselves are mature enough to understand the full process of how to classify jobs, how to value the jobs, and how to go through the full process. So I think there's going to be a learning curve there also for them. Employee representation, yes, it's fine. We should elect employee representatives. There's a law in Malta. If you have more than 50 employees, you have to. The reality of life, though, is that these employees generally don't even know they're, stepping into. So let alone would they be able to have the competence and ability to understand the complexity behind these laws and what we're trying to achieve with them. So there's going to be a huge learning curve there. And I think also for unions. To be clear, the directive is clear. There's also case law of the European Court of Justice, which says that just because a collective agreement creates a structure of salary grades doesn't mean that that is in line with the law. And therefore, everyone has to step back. And we know there's an ongoing issue at the moment about a collective agreement within the doctors section, right, in the medical section in Malta, where there's a collective agreement. And there's an agreement which came to light in discussion between unions and the employer, but now that is being challenged by members of the union itself. And this is where all of this can lead to. There have been other cases in Malta where employees contested the validity of a collective agreement entered into by a union. So it's complex, it's interesting. That's what I can say from a legal perspective on this, Mikela.
Very exciting legally, Paul. Very, very exciting. When it comes to these issues, I have seen, in the life cycle of even software. So we came together, and this is what we've said. This is not something that lawyers or HR consultants or software developers can solve alone, but it is something that has to, come together. And hence, this is why we have come together, to be able to look at it. And if you look at, for example, the Indigo platform and the insights that it gives you, even the gender pay gap that it gives you, immediately it flashes on your screen and you're like, this is like, there are going to be issues like attrition rate, for example, and retention rates and also gender pay gap. It's going to be one of the many statistics that we look at. I know that we're coming to the end of this podcast, but like a quick fire questions, one each, okay? So that we can, Lawrence, is this another piece of legislation and the Maltese will find a workaround, or is it a cultural shift?
For the people of goodwill, it's a culture shift, and they can do it. Like we've done other things, We've had our culture shifts in the past, starting from independence in 1964 to joining the European Union in 2004. So it should not be such a. For those who are hell bent on turning the law in their favour in every sort of respect, then they find a way of trying to get around it. But I believe in a labour market like ours is, I don't think there'll be much space left for those sort of people, because this is now an employees market. It will remain an employees market for many years to come. And therefore, employees will choose the good place to work.
I always say the workforce of the future will be employing Gen Z. And Gen Z will choose their workplaces. So it's no longer a question of who we want to bring into our organization. Do
Exactly.
the individuals that are in the workforce want to work for our organization?
That's it.
So I don't think organizations really have a choice. Paul, if you can give your clients a piece of advice when they're kind of embarking and navigating this legislation, what would it be?
Look, there's no need to panic. That's what I would say. But don't leave it till the last minute to try and patch up something, because it will not work that way. And I think embrace it as an opportunity to make your workplace more attractive, because once we embrace transparency as a positive thing rather than as this obstacle that we're going to face, I think we will realize as employers that it's what employees want, it's what the younger generation want. They want to understand where they stand, how they can progress within certain parameters. So this is not a free-for-all, there are parameters, but at least let's be transparent about it. It will give employees an idea of what they will get if they stay with your organization, and hopefully it would be attractive enough. It has to be something which is monitored on a regular basis. This is not a one-time exercise where you look at what you have today and that's it. It's something where the entire team in management and HR have to sit together on a regular basis to see where we stand, to see if there are suddenly, statistics which are showing some red flag. And in time, as you go along this journey, you will have to tweak here and there to make it work. But that is it. I think now's the time to sit down and start working towards compliance.
And we can reduce the taboo. I mean, I worked with, in the public sector for a long time, and the salary structures are there. You know exactly what you're going to be earning at what level as you progress, and you don't you can't really get confused, and nobody really discuss salaries exactly for that reason. In the private sector, it's something completely different. What do you think is the biggest opportunity, Lawrence, of this legislation?
The opportunity to introduce good HR practices.
So which is great for HR professionals out there. This is a perfect opportunity
for the real HR professionals out there.
Yeah, but there is nothing stopping HR professionals from becoming, truly effective strategic professionals. Yeah. At the end of the day, I always say HR is not rocket science, but we get it wrong more often than we get it right. And on a final note, Paul, if you can, so Employment 360, the conference that is being organized on the 13th of March, exactly on this subject. What are participants to expect? It's going to be organized by Fenech and Shireburn. Lawrence is going to be there also on the panel, and a number of individuals on the panel. What are the takeaways of the conference? What are we trying to achieve?
Look, the idea is to get the audience to listen to something practical, to understand how to plan ahead. Right? Today we've spoken high level about what it is that we have to look out for. The conference, the idea is to get people who have experience, know-how. We will have the DG from the DIR, who will eventually be part of the implementation of this directive, which has to be transposed by June next year. She will be sitting around the table with us. The idea is to bring also Shireburn into the picture from a tech perspective, yourself and people like you from the HR perspective, us from a legal, and then also Misco with the experience they have in terms of, consultancy, advisory, and the like. what are we going to be looking at? We want to look at practical examples of how to get things done. Okay, so we will look at what the law briefly says today, what will change tomorrow, and what it is that we have to prepare ourselves for. And the fine detail in the directive, which we didn't have time to get into today, like the complexities of having a multi-jurisdictional setup, for example, or a situation where you have a group of companies and the implication of how to do these assessments within that group. And the concept of worker, what type of workers are we talking about? How broad is the definition of worker under EU law? Which it is broad. We didn't have time to go into all of this today. And what I'm excited about is the fact that we got these people, we're going to have a nice panel lined up. We will have some others which will be published soon when we launch the actual program. And it is the concept that we have come up with this Employment 360. Employment 360 is this. It's a platform with which we are going to try to give people out there who are interested in HR and HR in Malta, and therefore employment law in Malta, this platform where they can have access to information which is practical to them and which exposes them to the solutions that they need to make this work.
As we said, the information out there is great. I think I'm excited as well about us being around the table together and working together to be able to bring to the public different perspectives, but we're all pulling the same rope. I'm very excited about this. When we in Malta introduced VAT, when we introduced the euro, this was really very, very, very difficult. When we introduced a different bus system, it was also very difficult. Today, we wouldn't have it any other way. We look back, Lawrence mentioned seatbelts. I also remember smoking on planes. It was a big tragedy when you couldn't smoke on a plane. Today, you wouldn't even dream of it. So this would be great for our workplaces. It's fantastic for our work cultures. And I think the future of Maltese workplaces looks very bright. But if we approach it with the right attitude, and I think all three of us agree that whilst it's going to be quite an interesting ride, it will also be a bumpy ride because we need to convince people slowly and steadily. I think ultimately we all stand to benefit, both the employer and also the employee. So on a last note, I'd like to thank Lawrence and Paul for the podcast. Also like to thank Shireburn and my colleagues at Shireburn and all the work that they do. And I know a lot has been put into this conference, Paul, especially on your team and our teams at Shireburn. And we invite you to join us at the conference to listen to more and to really expose yourself to the realities of the Pay Transparency Directive and practical tips and tricks on how to actually implement it in your day-to-day. Thank you for listening and good luck. We'll see you soon.